Hello, everybody. Welcome to the online gathering. This is a discussion about what methods are best for learning. And I had the idea, so I say in the subtext is plain Bob is traditional, but are there better options that promote better results? Which ones and why? And we'll just chat about ideas, and we'll try to give everybody a chance to uh, offer their opinions. Um, So one thing I was assuming tower bells, and uh, with plain Bob, part of my thought came from a discussion with Tim Barnes and Kira Chase, right? And they were getting away from plain Bob because there was some, the handling issues that uh, you're hunting all the way to the front and then dodging all of a sudden was frequently a mess and led to not really understanding what was going on. So they had some other options. And David, could you maybe refresh us about what your email
Yeah.
prompt was?
My email was mostly questioning. I didn't have an alternative suggestion as such. The conventional wisdom certainly is that once you've learned to handle, you learn call changes, kaleidoscope exercises, and you learn to move by one. That's fine. You've clearly got to learn to play and hunt, because there are occasions when you do hunt all the way from the front to the back, and the technique is very different from moving by one position. And the conventional wisdom is that having learned to play and hunt, the obvious first method is plain hunting, except plain Bob and Grandsire both come into that category. But it was mostly during COVID, when I was doing a lot of teaching in Ringing Room, that I began to wonder whether that was the case. In particular, I found, for example, teaching a group about touches of plain Bob Minor, the people found the running in, the running out, even the making the bob and what to do next straightforward. The people who went wrong were always the people dodging at the back. And generally speaking, this is an argument, incidentally, for plain Bob doubles. If you're going to have any of those methods, Grandsire and plain Bob Minor all have dodging at the back, and people get enormously confused about which is which in the up and down. I think that's because, let's take plain Bob Minor as an example. If you're doing a 3-4 up dodge, you are clearly hunting up. You're going from 1 to 2, and you're going to get to the back, and there's a dodge in the middle, easy, and ditto down. 5-6 up and 5-6 down really get people very muddled up. The fact that, and it's obvious to us, I hope, that when you get to a 5-6 up dodge, you're dodging from 6 to 5, but the fact that you immediately turn around means you get the dodge and lie, or lie and dodge. People get them horrendously muddled up. So I began to think about this, and more recently with courses we've started running in Australia, I found that people seem, to my mind, we've taught them to plain hunt, but the stress of, okay, I'm plain hunting now, there's some work coming up soon, where is it? Is it now or not? And oh, it's one of those dodges at the back, which way up is it? It's actually very, very stressful. That doesn't mean it's wrong. And other methods where it's run entirely by rules, people find very, very much easier. One of my favorites is the thing called All Saints. It has the advantage that there's no dodging anywhere, it's all places, but you learn it by rules. And the whole time you're thinking about, well, I know what I'm going to do this because the rule says, I do a crankshaft at the back. I come down, I see where the treble is, I either make seconds or long thirds. That's about it. Moving up to a much more advanced level, I'm at about the stage of just beginning to appreciate why people find Bristol Max very much easier than Cambridge and Yorkshire Max, because Bristol Max, the whole time, well, in my case, you're doing it more because you've actually learnt it, but you're following your memory of what you've learnt the whole time. You aren't doing something or other except when you don't. Now, that leads me into wondering as to whether plain Bob is actually the best method to do first. It certainly leads me to the conclusion that out of Grandsire, plain Bob doubles and plain Bob Minor, plain Bob doubles is certainly the best. It's the most awkward method in a way, but you don't have that thing at the back. It is quite clear that the work of the back is long fifths and it happens once. That's much easier. So I'd certainly put that ahead of the other ones. But the question was, is it better actually to start people off on a method like All Saints, or some of the people in discussion actually suggested Stedman was a good one. There's a lot to learn in Stedman, but again, it's rules. There are lots of practices that you can get through half there and that sort of thing. Hence the question, but it was very much a question, not a statement.
Okay, excellent.
That's it
So
from me.
anybody? Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, I had a question, David, sort of clarifying that, because you were saying that the problem comes at the bob. They don't know if they're running in or running out, they're okay, but making fourths is hard. But even in the plain course, do you think this is the problem? You sort of seem to
Yes.
jump from one to the other. I wasn't quite clear.
Yes. No, it
Okay.
merely became apparent because people who supposedly knew what they were doing,
Mhm.
people went wrong from time to time anyway, but it really struck me when introducing bobs, you'd have thought that it was the people affected by the bob that would have the most confusion, but it wasn't. It was the unaffected ones that every
Okay.
time did far worse than the others, which brought it home that they are the muddling ones. That's one point. The other one is that plain hunt all the time except when is actually quite stressful because you've got a big build up to it, and then oh, which one is it? Is it this one, that one? When does it come? So hence the question, would another method be better as a first one?
I heard of a tower where they start their beginners with Cambridge rather than plain Bob.
Okay.
And just as an anecdote, one of the Hawaii ringers visited the Seattle Tower, and so she was like very rusty at stuff, and she found Cambridge to be easier than plain Bob. And just as another comment, in my experience, people make fewer mistakes with Simon's doubles than plain Bob doubles.
David, do you have any comment on why why Cambridge might be easier, or St. Simon's might be easier? I have guesses.
I don't think Cambridge would be easier, but I do think again it's something where you keep your wits about you the whole time. I've certainly found people in striking competitions who prefer to ring Cambridge than plain Bob because it makes you concentrate. You don't go to sleep. Incidentally, who's the Hawaii bod? I've got.
I realize I have an issue, David Smith, because there are two Davids, and David Wilson is the one who mentioned that some people. David Wilson, do you have any guidance on why that the Cambridge would have been chosen?
I think it's what David Smith was saying is that you're more mentally engaged the whole time. It's not like you go to sleep and have to wake up at the right time.
These seem like two opposite. On the one hand, you're saying it's too difficult because you're constantly having to stress about when you're going to do your dodge. And on the other hand, you're saying you're boring and you're falling asleep. Those feel like opposite complaints.
Well, you fall asleep and then stress out about when to wake up.
I think we've got to be clear about whether we're looking at this from on top or underneath. I think one of the mistakes was made by the Pickled Egg project. Was there a whole lot of really expert ringers who can ring hundreds of surprise major methods, and they were looking at things like, is it more musical, is it easier to conduct? Now for the learner, those are completely irrelevant. I think we've got to make the distinction here. Cambridge is a better thing to ring in a striking competition if you're already a red zone ringer. Looking down on them from above, you might say, well, Cambridge is actually going to keep me awake more and I'll do better at it. But when you're doing your first method, I think none of that's relevant. So I would certainly not suggest Cambridge as a first method altogether.
Something we haven't mentioned is what kind of band you have to work with when people are learning, because I think that also comes into play. If you have if you have 5 people who are all trying to move on from call changes, you may do something different than if you have a band where you have 4 people or even 3 who can ring Aaron or Stedman or Cambridge or whatever. So that also comes into play and may vary what you do at a given time or in it with a given group of people.
I have a question with Plain Bob. The thing that I usually see is somebody hunts to the front and continues hunting to negative positions. You know, they hunt down, the bill starts swinging below balance, and they can't get it back up to balance, so they bring earlier and earlier. Is that something that other people see or no?
But I'm confused because you
Yeah.
said problem with Plain Bob, and
Oh,
that sounds like a problem with Plain Hunt.
yeah, well, I'm not sure what I said, but I see it with both. So,
And if they can't ring plain hunt, they shouldn't be learning methods. No, maybe that's a very elitist answer, but I feel like nobody's suggesting we go to Cambridge before they can plain hunt reliably.
Yeah, with
hope.
Yeah.
some funny exceptions, I'd say.
yeah.
But yes, there are others.
When-
Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question that I wonder, are we considering treble bob hunting as a method? And why don't we do that as a second after plain hunting?
I would say I wouldn't consider it as a method, but it's in the in the toolbox, as it were. It's a skill that that can be helpful for people, certainly. And in
So
some
does it
ways,
make,
it's easier than Plain Bob. I mean, in a lot of ways, because you dodge everywhere. You know, you never have to decide when to dodge, kind of.
so my real question, I guess, is should we throw that in after plain hunting? Before actually getting into another and I agree it's not a method in a sense. But should we
Well,
get people?
it's up to us and individuals, of course, right? Do you do that in Bob, or do you do that in Hendersonville, Bob? I mean, it makes sense to me. Is that something you do? Or do you have the horses to do that?
I have tried it, but I have some other people that have been ringing for a long time that sort of are fighting.
Interesting, sure, okay.
I certainly suggest it's a very good idea to do early. I don't know quite about that early, but one of the things about it is that once you've got someone who can ring a few minor methods, it gives them a huge confidence boost, because suddenly, you know, if it's a practice and you say, okay, let's do some more advanced stuff, let's ring Norwich Surprise or something, and they previously thought, oh, that's it for me, I'm out of it now. Suddenly they realize that if they can treble bob accurately, they can treble to surprise methods, and they're really valuable. And it's at the stage where they can go to any tower, even if its repertoire is pretty advanced, and they'll be useful. So it's a huge confidence boost that way.
I think Basta would be a reasonable method. I mean, as an alternative to treble bob hunt.
No, in a way, it's a step. It can be a step before, or if you have one person who's not ready for that, and you can then vary it with, let's see, doing places in 3-4 instead of dodging, so that you can start to introduce wrong places and things like that as well. So I'm a great fan of Basto. It's one of those methods that, of course, can be, when experienced people haven't been ringing it, they always forget what to do. So it can be entertaining as well.
So it sounds like you're sort of saying that what makes a good first method is one where they don't need to think too much. So if we're talking like treble bob hunting, you dodge everywhere. If it's Basto, you dodge everywhere except the front, this sort of thing. And the challenge in plain hunt is knowing when you don't do what you do the rest of the time. Is that fair to say? Because I mean, it is difficult to. I mean, I suppose it feels like learning to dodge is a skill, and that plain bob is the easiest way to start teaching that. Because if we're doing something like treble bob hunting, they have to be dodging a lot, and dodging isn't something they've necessarily done a huge amount of. Or is this what you're saying, sort of the kaleidoscope ring is for?
Mhm.
Well, I mean, if you're trying to teach dodging as a skill, it makes sense to do a method that has a lot of it rather than a method
Do more
that
of
has
it. No,
little
that's
of it.
fair. That's fair. Yeah.
Can I take up? You mentioned kaleidoscope. What I think I'm wondering is the sort of traditional approach is that once you've learned bell control, you learn to swap places by one, and you do it by call changes. Now, call changes has a lot of mental overhead of, which bell are you following and what bell would the bell that you're following be following if it was Thursday and that sort of stuff. And people get very confused about that. And kaleidoscope exercises, by comparison, teach you to move by one and get rid of all that overhead so you can concentrate on what it is you're trying to learn. And I think that's pretty universally accepted now. I'm just wondering if there isn't an equivalent thing that we ought to be doing for the first method. We've followed it on from plain hunt because you do plain hunt, so plain hunt with some extras is obviously a good idea. And if we question that, is there another way of going about it that actually would make more sense? What are we trying to achieve by giving you a first method? Is it just an introduction to method rigging of any sort, or are we trying to teach you about dodging? Why do we teach methods at all? How do we choose the first one? I don't think anyone's really sort of questioned that much. I mean, hence, sorry, Nick, your comment at the beginning, I'll be talking about deciding between plain Bob and Grandson. That's what just about everybody would say. Well, no, maybe there are other things.
I would think that you said the word, maybe I didn't quite get you. What I heard you say, David, was that why teach methods at all? And I think you're going to teach some methods at some point. Did I miss it? Okay, good. All right.
No, what I meant was, I didn't mean why do it, meaning should we do it at all? I mean, why are we teaching methods? What skills are we trying to introduce with the first method? I'm not saying we shouldn't do it.
Got it. Okay.
Well, I mean, in theory, I think the theory is that we're trying to teach in steps so that people accumulate skills that they can progressively use as they move into a variety of methods. And dodging is one of the skills. Being able to dodge and then stop dodging is in some ways a different skill. I mean, if you're dodging all the time, you can build up a rhythm to that, but if you dodge and then have to place in the same positions, that's a little bit different, which gets into the Cambridge or kaleidoscope too. So most discussion, like when you get into discussion about things like which surprise major or surprise minor method should you teach first and which major method first and things, a lot of it gets into, well, this one is easier and this one allows you to build on it and stuff. So I think that's one of the things we're looking at.
Yeah, I'm going to step in. Miriam, I'm curious if you recall what is generally done or what you did in Raleigh.
I think
and did you like it or not? Yeah.
I think the conventional way of learning plain hunt, then plain Bob, and then Grancer.
Okay.
That's why this topic is kind of interesting to me.
And I'm curious, Ed Futcher does a lot of the training there, right? But he hasn't, I don't know that he did when you were starting. Was
No,
he?
No.
he wasn't there originally.
Yeah, so did that,
No.
is that any differences, or?
I remember there was a gentleman named Bob Stokes
Mhm.
that we learned because we were all a new band
Mhm.
and it was
Mhm.
floundering for a while. And then John Mabe came along really quickly. And then, of course, Richard Parsons was there.
Mhm. Were there changes in approach with those that you remember?
No, I don't remember.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Gosh, it's been what, 35 years ago?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. Yeah, good, all right.
I did have a question.
Oh, good.
How do you teach rope sight? Or you just depend on people to all of a sudden see it? Because people tend to know the methods, but just don't see rope sight. And therefore, they're not always looking at the person they're dodging with. So I'm just curious.
Lots of people could jump in. Simon, get ready. I was just curious if you had any thoughts on rope sight.
Rope sight, it's trial and error. It's basically pushing through until it eventually you eventually see it. Was my experience, and my experience also teaching people as well. There's no tricks to revealing that to people. That's, I guess, part of this conversation is there a faster road than trial and error?
Anybody have a faster road than trial and error?
I have a different problem, which is I spend a lot of time trying people not to use rope sight. I think the traditional teaching approach is, particularly if you get in plain hunt, you can and often do learn plain hunt, and I'm not against this, by knowing exactly that I'm following you, then you, then you, then you. You do it by rote, and you therefore get the idea that when you're ringing Cambridge or something like that, you know who you're following every time, and you don't because you've learned it. If you're trying to do step and sinks or something like that, the important message is if you get to the back and you're dodging 10, 11 down and you can't work out who you're dodging with, it really doesn't matter. Just listen and ring in the right position. As long as you get down the front and you've worked out who's in front of you, it's okay. But you do not need to look at who you are interacting with. You can if you want, and it sometimes helps. For example, I mean, we've got a couple of ringers who are good musicians, and one's got slightly defective eyesight, and she tended to be one of these people who looks at the floor the whole time. And we had to teach her, please, step and doubles is a very good example. Please look at the person you're dodging with when you're in 4-5, not to help you, but to help them. They're not as good as you, they're learning, and it really reassures them. But if anything, I would say that's I think one of the advantages of simulators we used without screens. It teaches you to listen. And certainly, you talked about the Northwest course. I'm running the Starting Surprise one there. And one of the things that is immediately apparent is, are you a ringer who listens to their position and therefore can ring a blue line? Or are you relying on who you're following the whole time? Because if you're relying on who you're following the whole time, you're not going to be able to ring it.
Yeah.
I can remember when I was learning, this goes back some years in Honolulu when none of us were actually experienced ringers. But my first really watching and learning rope sight was when I was covering. And that ended up as all of a sudden it dawned on me that I'm really, this is what rope sight's all about. And from then on, being relatively inside doing things, it was not all that difficult. But doing it when we were covering, whether it was 6 or 8 bells, made a big difference in learning that.
I agree. I think covering I think it's an essential step to rope sight. The fact that you could see all the bells in front of you, and I think it's often overlooked the importance of that because I think it's called the Pittman method now. But basically, the idea of plain hunting down to the front was there's a bunch of bells in front of you. Just pick off the last one, then follow the other bunch of bells, and pick off the last one, then follow the bunch of bells and pick off the last one. You eventually end up the front, and that teaches you the rope sight to see which bell is the last one, and you're basically hunting them off one by one, picking them off one by one.
And my wife does that quite a bit. That's one thing she talks about doing quite regularly. I would say when I was talking about covering, I think at that point I was able to count up to my place 6, 7, 8. Whether I was in 6 or 8, I could stay there fairly steadily, consistently, which probably helped also.
Noah, I'm going to invite you to say anything. If you would, do you have any burning questions or answers?
Not especially. The main thing I sometimes think about when reflecting on my own learning that hasn't necessarily come up is odd bells, ringing on odd numbers versus even numbers of bells. Since, as Tom knows, I learned methods on handbells before I could even ring plain hunt safely, and as a result, I'm still not entirely comfortable with making long fits and doubles and things like that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's what thought doubles or odd versus even methods is in the mix. Having learned on handbells and not, I I don't gravitate towards odd bell methods. And a lot of times I go to someplace and they want to ring an odd bell method to give the security of the tenor behind, and somehow I cringe at that. I know I shouldn't, but I think I do. I know I do. But
Meanwhile, in Rochester, it's not unheard of for us to ring minimus with a cover.
Oh, yeah, no,
Oh.
which is quite reasonable.
yeah, well, I'll tell you, the strip we're on, we've got people that are doing, we're trying to get them to hunt, but we've done lots and lots and lots of hunts on 3 bells with 3 covers, and that I think has been helpful. And
One,
then we can build on that.
one of the things that talking about odd versus even brings to mind is that as teachers or as experienced ringers, I think sometimes we explain things to the detriment of our students. So if, for example, if we're starting with somebody, if we're getting somebody to start playing hunting and they haven't really done much, saying to them, well, remember, you're going to be hitting 5th place if it's on 5 at a backstroke first and then a hand stroke. Don't let that throw you. Well, they have no idea, when they first start, whether they're going to be hitting there at a backstroke or a hand stroke. And we're suddenly telling them something that's making them nervous, whereas if they just go to 5ths and come back, they're going to end up okay. And I think I can't think of other examples, but I think there are various times that we know things that we use that are useful, but at the very beginning, when you're first learning things, they just clutter the mind, kind of.
Mhm.
And the other thing we haven't talked, it was mentioned, but we didn't talk a lot about the starting people, skipping plain hunt. Although I'm not quite sure quite how it gets skipped or if it gets skipped completely or only on numbers more than 3 or something, and going straight to Stedman or Aaron, which is Aaron is what is gospel in New York. And there was some amount I have a little problem in Washington because when I started before we got into a long period in which Rick Dirksen was teaching, but I know that he at least introduced Stedman fairly early, and he tended, I think, more towards Granser than plain Bob at first. And there are things about both Aaron and Stedman that have a lot to be said for them.
I have kind of a side comment, kind of not side, but it's clear that you want somebody to understand what they're supposed to do. You want them to ring this method. Well, too often, certainly it happens the other way around, where they don't really know what they're supposed to do, and surprise, surprise, it doesn't work that great. And one thing that we've been doing here, and I tend to do and I like, is I'll have somebody ring a bell on their own, right? But we'll work through, so they're doing a hunt on 4 bells or whatever, and they're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and strike their bell in the right position. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But they're ringing. Nobody else is ringing with them. and just individually ringing that, but placing their bell, moving their bell. And one, it does a bunch of things that I like. It, you know, gives them a sense of how they need, what control they need to make the bell do what they want. It also reveals immediately if they don't really get it, you know, if they don't know what they're supposed to do, without, you know, having a whole band around and having a big blow up, and you don't really know what the problem was potentially. It's very clear what, so that's something I do and I like. That, and of course that works with any method. That's why it's a side comment.
I recently did that, having somebody basically plain hunting, just counting up to 6 or 8 up and down. And I was surprised at how quickly that person was actually striking fairly well on the plain hunting, just ringing it all by themselves. So I really did like that. And I had not really used that with anybody before. The other thing, I'm curious, going back to the idea of rules. Do people think of passing the trouble as a rule? Do they use that?
Sure.
Speaking as somebody who learned to ring handbells, I'm aware of the trouble, but I don't, saying this is when I pass is something I don't use. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it's interesting.
I think, I don't, let's see, I don't think of it as a rule in the same way as make thirds if the treble's below you, make thirds and out if the treble's below you. It is something that can tell you where you pass the treble can be very useful information, but for me, it's not a rule.
David Wilson, you would agree, I suspect, that it'd be wise to know where the trouble is at all times, right?
Well, yes. Well, unless you're ringing a principal, in which case maybe.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah.
Care. Well, anyway, speaking of rules, I like Dixon's Bob, which may not be relevant to this discussion, but I think it's a useful skill.
Yeah, and it's one you can explain what it is in a minute. It's what I find curious about it is that there are some people who absolutely hate it and won't ring it. I don't know why. Because I agree, I think it can be an very interesting to try.
David Wilson, I hope you will be very pleased that Sean Liu and I exposed Simon here to Dixon's Bob this week.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. And
A
David
lot of
has
fun it was
exposed.
too.
Oh, yeah.
So I have an observation that we were talking about plain Bob as not being the right method because it's plain hunt until it's not plain hunt. So maybe the problem is not with the method, but maybe that's the way we're teaching it, because plain Bob is a rules-based method. We all dodge when the treble leads. So instead of teaching it as we just plain hunt until we don't, and then the circle of work, 3, 4 down, all of that, we just teach the rule. Everyone dodges wherever you are when the treble leads. And that teaches them to observe the treble and then follow a rule. And then there's no
I've been in
to do.
bands where the treble gets lost.
Well, that's true, but that's, yeah.
There's a question about, is it the rule or is it the handling, the execution of, putting the bell where you want it?
I go ahead, David.
That's a very good point. I think I was going to make the point that we've been talking about methods. We've also been talking about exercises. When you ring an exercise, you are very clear in your mind what you're trying to achieve. You choose a particular exercise in order to get across a particular point or enhance a particular skill. And when we are ringing a method, we don't really, it's self-justifying. We're ringing Kent or playing Bob because that's the object of the exercise. Can I give as an example an exercise that I like quite often? You know, when you've got people perhaps who are a bit too given to look at the bell they're following and follow it, and then somebody slows down a little bit, and so the bell following them slows down a bit too because they're following it, and the whole thing sort of goes. An exercise that I like doing for that, which I think is very, very good altogether, is to put the particular person who's relying too much on rope side on, say, the 3, put myself on the 2, ring rounds, and then just stop ringing without warning. And you'll find that, to exaggerate slightly, the person who's totally into following will stop ringing as well on the 3. Why did you stop? Well, I was following the 2 and you stopped, so I stopped. I mean, I'm following you. Other people will sort of look a bit surprised and then carry on ringing, and after a bit they'll be following the 1. So they'll just go 1, 3, 4, 5, 6. And after a bit of discussion, people get the idea that you want to ring 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it is the position that you're ringing. And third position doesn't mean you're the third bell down. It means you would be the third bell down if everyone was in the right place. But it encourages that idea of counting and feeling where you ought to be. And it's very much easier to do that by having a bell just stop altogether than what happens in real life, where one bell's off with the pixies somewhere.
I love
But
that. Yeah.
I think that illustrates why you've got a particular problem. You have an exercise that deals with it, and you apply that exercise. I'm wondering if we ought to have that sort of mindset a bit more with methods. Why are we ringing this method? What skill are we trying to introduce? And certainly with playing Bob, I agree. I mean, there are 3 ways of working out what your work is. One is the circle of work, one is where you cross the treble, and one is when the treble leads. And ideally, we want people to be aware of all 3 of them.
To come back to your question, Tom, about is it bell control or confusion?
Yeah.
I think it's confusion more often because I've encountered so many people who understandably, I'm assuming what's going on is it's an up dodge, but I'm stepping down to make it kind of thing, that they just can't keep straight which is which. So they're
Yeah.
confused about,
Mhm.
Am I dodging up? And if I'm dodging up, what does that mean? For some reason, that's hard to get in.
Yeah.
And
I didn't worry about that for 15, 20 years. I just dodged when it was time.
well, you may have been somebody, but some people find it, again, and when what one uses depends both on the band you have, and it depends somewhat on the individual too. I think you start to, some people, it becomes apparent this person is going to benefit from this more than from
Yeah,
that
sure.
right now.
Yeah,
So it's not just what your whole band can do, but what the particular individual who's learning is going to benefit from.
I think I'm going to stop the recording now. I thank you very, very much. And we can continue a little bit. And people, if you're watching the recording, you might have missed something great. Who knows?